Kia ora. Today we're with Colin James, the head of cybersecurity for Vodafone Group across both the Asia Pacific, Africa and the Middle East regions. Thanks for joining us today, Colin.
Kia ora.
Now, just thinking about the most pressing issue going on right now in cybersecurity, the events, the tragic events in Christchurch, and thinking about the broader issues across security and internet culture. Already there has been one man that has been in court for sharing the clip, and across organisations in New Zealand there has been sort of strict rules around not sharing it because it is against the law. How can an organisation, without being too big brother, prevent these sort of things happening in a workplace?
So I suppose there's a couple of layers of defence that an organisation can look at. The first one is making sure that your employees are aware of the behaviours that are acceptable within the organisation, and that's usually through an acceptable use policy or something like that that says, this is what we tolerate, this is what we don't tolerate within our workplace, because you need that basis anyway before you can actually move any further. And then the second layer would be to use technology to try and help prevent people from getting access to some of that information. So that could be through filtering the internet traffic for looking for categories. So, for example, weapons or pornography or things like that, to stop people from accessing those sites. It's very hard with this sort of event, and it's such a tragic event, but it's very hard to actually narrow down the data that was being used, because it was two particular files and they were being spread around the internet. It's very, very hard to actually track that sort of thing down from a small organisation's point of view. So just using a general category filter that actually blocks out a whole category range is probably the easiest way.
Now, many organisations have their own bring your own device policy. So we have people bring in their own smartphones, their own tablets, but they're filled with sort of confidential information about the company. So how do we have a BYOD policy but prevent sort of leaks and that information getting out to the public?
Yeah, BYOD presents an interesting conundrum for organisations, because traditionally when you think about how a business operated, you kind of had this perimeter that protected your information, and then people would come into the network and they'd use devices already within the perimeter and it's all safe and sound. But now we live in a world where people are taking devices out of the perimeter, they take them home, sometimes their kids might access the device and download dodgy software onto it, and then they bring it back into the organisation, and then therefore you're bringing these risks or vulnerabilities into your organisation. So there's a couple of approaches that organisations need to consider. One is, how do you protect the information no matter where it sits? So you shouldn't be reliant on protecting data just because it's inside your network. You need to start thinking about, how do you protect the data no matter where it sits? So how do you build controls around the information, like encrypting files, so that if someone does access the device, they can't even read the information on it. And then making sure that it can't be printed or sent to other email accounts or things like that. The other thing is then, as you bring devices into your organisation, how do you check to make sure they're clean? So how do you have network controls that actually ensures that the antivirus is working on the machine before you actually allow it to join the network and things like that. So you can protect your network from getting these outside threats coming in.
Now, whatever technology protections a company has in place, they can't really prevent carelessness and human error. So how does a company get around that issue?
So one of the hardest things to prevent is a malicious threat. So someone who's really wanting to get information out of an organisation. That's always the hardest thing to stop. But mistaken, I suppose, access of information or leakage of information is really where you need to focus. Now, there are applications out there. There's programs called data loss prevention programs. So they're all about ensuring that you, again, build those controls around the data, so that no matter where it sits, if someone leaves their laptop at a bar and someone steals it, then they can't access the information that's on it because it's encrypted and protected and things like that. So that's the key thing, is how do you prevent accidental leakage of data, because that's always going to happen. We've seen plenty of evidence of that in the past, where people have emailed the wrong person someone else's files and things like that. So how do you ensure that if that does happen, they can't even access the information anyway? So that's about building those controls. And then secondly, if you are going to try and go down the path of preventing that malicious person from getting information out, that becomes a lot more complicated, because when you think about it, there's so many ways to get information out of an organisation. We've seen plenty of evidence from the US, Bradley Manning and people like that, for example, working in the most sensitive secret areas of the US Defence Department, and they were able to get data out. So it becomes a very, very difficult situation if you're going to try and prevent that malicious attack.
Now, bringing it back to the home, with IoT, Internet of Things, smart homes, I myself have recently invested in some smart bulbs, a heat pump, etc. My concern is with cybersecurity, as we get a more connected home, I guess I'm nervous that I don't want to have my, my house hacked. How do we go about keeping that secure as well?
Internet of Things is one of the hardest things around keeping security, and it's one of the growing trends at the moment. Obviously, more and more people are starting to introduce technologies into their homes, wearable technologies like watches and things like that. So as the proliferation of this technology starts to reach the average household, you do have to wonder, well, what can it be done? What can be done with it? How can it be used against us? I think the key is really, because there's not a lot the average person can do in their home to protect themselves, it's all around buying reputable brands, so things that, decent quality brands of equipment, not things that you buy from a second-hand shop, or you're not quite sure about the quality of the make of it. Yep. Something is going to be updated regularly, because that's the key thing. Vulnerabilities will always happen with technology. When people write code, they don't necessarily allow for every possible scenario, and things will crop up. So you need to have something that can be updated easily enough. But I think it's just awareness, really. Just know what your devices are, what devices you've got in your household, and I suppose there's not a lot you can really do to monitor them or track them. On a telco point of view, we do kind of see attack traffic that is occurring around the Mirai botnet and things like that previously, which were using IoT devices. It is becoming more and more prevalent out there that people are starting to use these devices, both from using them like botnets, so being able to use their processing power to launch denial of service attacks or things like that. We're also starting to see them being used in ransomware as well. Wow. So there was a research done last year by one of the universities overseas where they were able to prove that you could use a TV connected to the internet and ransomware the TV effectively, so people couldn't watch it unless they paid a ransom. So.
Well, hopefully that doesn't happen for me. Now, security problems often occur because users are using the same password for both multiple accounts, multiple devices. But the counter-argument to that is I don't want to have multiple passwords because they're hard to remember. So what's the solution there?
Unfortunately, there's no real easy solution. Passwords are a hard thing for security because people will say use long passwords, and that becomes hard to remember, and use complex passwords, which makes it even more complicated for people to remember. So there's no real simple way. I suppose the easiest thing is to use a vaulting technology. So something that you can store all your passwords in, that you can then reference to get access to the right passwords.
Like a password manager?
Password manager, password vault, but again, looking for a reliable brand, not something that hasn't got very good ratings or anything. So do the research before you pick one. The other thing is two-factor authentication is always a key. So then if your password is compromised in any way, unless they have access to the second factor, whatever that may be, they're still not going to get access to your information. And you're seeing that happen a lot more now. So Apple, Google, they're all starting to use or offer two-factor authentication as a secondary option.
And the likes of Touch ID and sort of Face ID, are they more secure or just as secure as passwords? What would you prefer to use?
So they're effectively a form of the second factor in some way, because obviously your face or your finger has to be present for you to actually get access. So it does add a different layer into it. Is it more secure than passwords? There's a lot of debate as to which way that goes. Some researchers would say passwords is still better, but then how easy do you make a password? When I talk about passwords, I always think passphrases as opposed to words.
I see.
So instead of, because the hardest thing for people to remember is a word that might be 12 characters long or something like that. How do you think of a word that long? But if you think of it in terms of a sentence or something like that, a line from your favourite song or something like that, it becomes a lot easier to create a longer password that becomes more complicated for people to break.
And with this in mind, what do you see as the biggest cybersecurity threats for 2019?
So I think we're going to see, we see a continuation really in the traditional attacks. So DDoS is still a very popular source of attack, both against organisations and actually against individuals, particularly in the gaming sector. We see an increase in ransomware still. So ransomware is still very, very popular out there, both from a encrypting information, but also being used against people for sexploitation and other things like that. And I think Internet of Things start to take off. We're starting to see more and more devices appearing, more wearable technologies. Households are getting more and more, like you say, connected devices within them. So I think that's really going to be the next big area that we're going to have to focus in on.
Now, as a business, what's one thing they can do to increase their cybersecurity?
So from a business point of view, it's really what we call the cybersecurity basics. So it's all around the hygiene of your organisation, so patching of infrastructure. So making sure if you've got servers, they've got the latest patches, particularly security patches on. Desktops have got the latest patches on, because at the end of the day, if someone's trying to effectively break into your organisation, they're going to look for vulnerabilities that exist within the software that you're using. So making sure that's up to date is really the key.
And from a personal perspective at home, what can your average Joe do to be more secure?
The easiest thing for the average home user is passwords. So don't share the same passwords. Have different passwords at different sites, like we've already talked about. But and have something that you can manage your passwords with if you can't remember them. So have a vaulting tool or something. Don't write them, stick them on a sticky note on the side of your computer or anything like that. And certainly don't share passwords. But yeah, make sure they're unique and not easy to guess.
Thank you very much, Colin.
Thanks.
And if you'd like to hear Colin speak, he's speaking at the PwC Herald Talks, and you can find out more at pwcheraldtalks.co.nz.